Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to the front line with Joe and Joe. Joe Pasillo, as always, joined by Joe Rossinello. And once more, dear brothers and sisters, let us go into the breach on the Veritas Catholic Radio Network, 1350 on your AM dial, 103.9 on your FM dial, spreading the truth of the Catholic faith to the New York City metropolitan area. Two things, please download the app, share it with your friends. You'll have access to all of our station's content. And if you like what Joe and I do, we go live on social media Thursday nights at 9 o'clock Eastern time, and we obviously leave all our shows up there, including our interviews like the one we're having today, and our social commentary and political commentary. And you'll find us on X, Facebook, YouTube, Rumble, the whole nine yards. Today, Joe and I always say we're going into the breach. And nowadays, you want to talk about China, you're going into the breach. And if you ever want to talk about the devil, you're going into the breach. Well, today we have the perfect person to go into the breach with us, Stephen Mosher, and he's written a new book, The Devil and Communist China. Now, that's available at Tan Books. We always encourage our audience to buy the book from the publishers to support not only the authors, but also our Catholic publisher. Stephen will let us know in a little bit where else you could buy the book. Now, many of you out there, excuse me, many of you out there know Stephen Mosher. Having said that, he is an internationally recognized authority, on China and population issues, which we're going to get into a little bit also, as well as an acclaimed author and speaker. He's worked tirelessly since 1979 to fight coercive population control programs. He's helped hundreds of thousands of women and families worldwide over the years. In 1979, Stephen was the first American social scientist to visit mainland China. He was invited there by the Chinese government, where he had access to government documents and actually witnessed women being forced to have abortions under the new, at that time, new one-child policy. Mr. Mosher was, interestingly enough, a pro-choice atheist at the time, but witnessing to these traumatic abortions led him to reconsider his convictions and to eventually become a practicing pro-life Catholic. Stephen has appeared numerous times before Congress as an expert in world population, China, and human rights abuses. He's also made TV appearances all over the place. Good Morning America, 60 Minutes, Today Show, 2020, Fox, CNN, as well as a regular guest on talk radio shows across the nation. He is also the author of the best-selling A Mother's Ordeal, One Woman's Fight Against China's One-Child Policy. And articles by Mr. Mosher have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Reader's Digest, The New Republic, Washington Post, National Review, and others. Stephen Mosher, welcome to the front line with Joe and Joe, our brother.
No, it's good to be here with you.
Thank you, Stephen. This is going to be an excellent conversation. Like I said, we're going to hand it over to Joe, and we will get started.
Stephen, we always begin with a prayer to Our Lady in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Remember, O most gracious Virgin Mary, never was it known that anyone who sought your help or sought your intercession was left unaided. Inspired by this confidence, we fly unto you, a virgin of virgins, our mother. To you we come, for you we stand, sinful and sorrowful. Mother of the Word incarnate, despise not our petitions, but in your clemency hear and answer us. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, ultimately, Stephen, as you know, the greatest teacher is life itself. And I want to begin the conversation with Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He was a brilliant man, but he also went to prison. He spent a number of years in prison. He witnessed what communism was all about, but more importantly, he felt what communism was all about. This is what he said: both in theory and practice, communism is completely inhuman. Break this down for us. Why was he right?
Well, he's right because communism is a philosophy based on hatred of God, and it poses the idea that of the ancient serpent that we can create, we human beings, through our own abilities, can create heaven on earth. And of course, earth is intended to be a testing ground, sometimes a vale of tears. We're on a journey here to get to heaven. The idea that human beings, by their own devices, can pull themselves up by their bootstraps and create heaven on earth has always led to hell on earth. Oddly enough, there's an ancient Chinese strategist writing 2,500 years ago who said, an evil man will burn his country to the ground in order to rule over the ashes. Well, that's exactly what communism does. Evil men rise to the top of this communist fantasy that we're going to create heaven on earth. And they literally burn countries to the ground in order that they can rule over the ashes. And they don't care how many corpses they create. Obviously, Mao Zedong didn't care how many corpses he created because he killed about 100 million Chinese over the course of his long political career.
Why is it that you're the bad guy, Stephen Mosher, when you point that out? And what I mean by that is, I mean, I've had this conversation, and I don't know. I've seen it out in public, on shows, and I've had personal conversations like this. A lot of times when you're dealing with atheists, some friendly, some not so friendly. What you get is the Catholic Church, blah, 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 blah. The Catholic Church committed this atrocity, that atrocity. Never did. Christopher Hitchens claimed the Catholic Church never did anything good for humanity. And my argument is always the same. Well, what has atheism brought us? Communism, piles of bodies, rivers of blood. And they seem to be very slick in deflecting and saying, well, communism is actually a religion too. And in certain ways, on certain levels, I believe that there is and I just where I'm going with this, and I'd like your comments. Communism, there is a religious impulse there, okay, even though it's not what we know as authentic religion, but nonetheless, it's not religion, okay. It is system. The central tenet of communism is systematic atheism. I don't know how the atheists get around that argument. Communism has provided nothing but misery. Any objective person has to see that. Yet you could still teach it in college campuses, and not only teach it, but you could support it. I'm throwing it over to you. I think you know where I'm going.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, it's all over college campuses. I was at Stanford back in the late 1970s, early 80s. We had we had 24 people in the anthropology department on the faculty. 22 were liberal Democrats. One was a communist, and one was a lone Republican. They thought they had balance because they had a communist and a Republican. Obviously, they didn't. And among the teachers at Stanford when I was there was not just John Gurley, who wrote lots of books about how wonderful life was under Mao Zedong and how he was creating a new socialist man and a new socialist woman. At the same time, he was actually creating mass graves. But the other person who was there was Kamala Harris's dad, Professor Harris, who was also in the economics department. Although he didn't teach economics, he taught communism. And yeah, now we know where she gets it. But yeah, these were all people at Stanford living in their ivory towers who had actually never been to or if they'd been to, hadn't stayed for a very long time in a communist country. Now, so I left Stanford in 1979, headed to China, believing that, you know, the Chinese Communist Party may have done lots of good for the Chinese people. But I was living in China for over a year, lived in Asia for 10 years, in Hong Kong, Taiwan, mainland China. I speak, read, and write Chinese. It didn't take long for me to understand that while the people in Hong Kong were thriving under the British rule of law, and respect for property rights, while the people in Taiwan were thriving under a regime that was authoritarian but didn't attempt to control every aspect of their lives and would later become democratic. The people in China were suffering. It didn't take long for the people in China in this commune I was living in to tell me that their lives had been better off in 1949 than they were in 1979. Imagine that, 30 years under communism without progress. Actually, without any progress, actually retrograde action. People had died during the purges in the 1950s, the anti-rightist campaigns, the capitalists had been killed, anyone associated with the old regime had been killed, the landlords had been tortured, and many had been killed. Then came the great forced collectivization into the communes, where anyone who resisted was tortured and killed. Then came the great famine after the commune system was established, because again, as you say, Joe, the communism is better at creating tyranny than creating the goods or creating food. So 45 million people died in the early 1960s. The greatest famine in human history was not caused by overpopulation. No, it was caused by excessive government. It was a man-made famine. I like to call it a Mao-made famine because it was made by Chairman Mao's ridiculous idea of creating heaven on earth. He was going to create a perfect society, and he didn't care how many people he had to kill on the way to creating that perfect society. So I lived in a communist country for a long time. I just wish that someone like Professor Gurley, or Professor Harris, when Kamala was a little girl, had actually gone to Cuba and lived there for a year, long enough to see through the facade of communism, where we're all equal and everybody is given goods according to their need, and see the reality of tyranny, maybe, she would have grown up to be a different person than she is.
Maybe Stephen Mosher is joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe. His new book is out from Tan Books, The Devil and Communist China. Stephen, where else could our audience members buy the book outside of the publisher?
Well, the publisher is a good place to start. It's TANBooks.com, one word, TAN Books. If they want an autographed copy, they can go to our website at Population Research Institute. The website is pop.org, POP.org. I'm a POP. I have 9 children, but POP in this case is Population Research Institute, pop.org, and they can get it from us as well.
Thank you for that, Stephen. Joe Rossinello, where do you want to go?
I want to break down a couple things you said. We began the conversation where you said that communism has a hatred for God. When you don't have God as your basis, power is your basis. How or why would you care for people if you don't care for God? You care for yourself. You care for power. You're trying to create heaven here, like you said. I think that is the root of the problem. That's the first thing I'd like you to comment on. Secondly, you mentioned colleges. They can't sell communism by using the word communism. Talk about how the word has been repackaged. We are secular humanists in the West today. All the institutions of power are embraced by that ideology. They can't sell it in the terms of communism or even, frankly, socialism. So they repackage it: transhumanism, secular humanism. It sounds better, it's more palatable, and the people are eating it up. But in the end result, it's the same: suffering. Please break those two ideas down.
Well, yeah, I mean, when you're propagating a failed idea, you have to keep repackaging it in order to successfully market to the next generation of people who come on the scene. Young Americans who, without any direct experience of communism, are innocent and naive when it comes to political matters, and have been mistaught not only about the founding of the United States of America, which is unique in the history of the world, but about the nature of communism, Marxism, cultural Marxism, socialism, liberalism, wokeism, whatever you want to call it. The continued renaming is a sign that the underlying idea is a lie. And interestingly enough, Joe, the Communist Party admits that its ideology is a fabrication and its history is also a lie. Well, how do they admit that? Well, back in 2013, right after the current dictator, Xi Jinping, took power. The current dictator, Xi, is a lot like the first Red Emperor, Mao Zedong. We can talk about that. But when he took power, the Chinese Communist Party published a document listing the perils, the dangers to continued Communist Party rule. Now, some of the dangers were things that people can easily understand. They identified the rule of law as a danger. They identified true democracy as a danger. But they also identified, get this, an accurate accounting of the history and the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party would be a threat to its continued rule. Well, why would an accurate accounting of the history of the Communist Party be a threat to its continued rule? Because that history is a history of one bloody purge, persecution after another, which has resulted in the death of 100 million Chinese. The Communist Party is the biggest killing machine in human history. An accurate accounting of the ideology, of course, would reveal that it's nothing but a fantasy, because you never get to that perfect world where everyone is equal, where everyone is producing according to their ability, and everyone is receiving goods according to their need, and the government fades away. That never happens. That's a fantasy. The Communist Party knows that. And that's why they published this secret Central Committee directive, letting all the senior Communist Party leaders know that anyone who writes an accurate history or accounting of the ideology is a threat to their continued rule. So they themselves admit that it's a fabrication used to deceive the masses. And boy, have they deceived the masses. And as far as America is concerned, when I talk to senior Communist Party officials, they will frequently say that Americans are innocent and naive and easily deceived. And we are. We are. In part because of our Christianity, we tend to put the best face on everything. We tend not to to attribute base motives to people. We try to put the best interpretation on people's actions, in part because we haven't been taught the history of communism, as opposed, and we haven't been taught the accurate history of our own country, for goodness sake, that young Americans are innocent and naive. And every young generation, is a new wave of barbarians coming into your country. And if you don't take those young barbarians and properly educate them in school about the history of their own country, teach them to love their country, love God, and love their neighbor, they're going to continue to be barbarians, and they can be deceived into I don't know, demonstrating on campuses for from the river to the sea right now.
Right, and setting up encampments, but demanding their meal program in the meantime, which I kind of chuckled when I saw that video. I was like, really? In the midst of all this, you're worried the students who have the meal program are required to be fed. I thought that was pretty funny. Stephen Mosher is joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe. And please, 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 please go out and buy his book, The Devil and Communist China. That is available at TANBooks. I have a question, Stephen, but I will say this as a comment. The reason why I probably would never get elected president of the United States, aside from the fact that I wouldn't want the job, is on day one, I would tell the Department of Education, you will not get one more dime of federal money. Not one. Okay, not one, unless you require in all the institutions that get federal money, okay, including Harvard and Yale, by the way, because they get a whole bunch of federal money, unless the students are taught the textbook required in whichever class you want is the Black Book of Communism, which I remember reading about 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And I think if anybody read that, all right, I think if anybody actually sat, that's a thick book because the crimes of the communists are numerous. I think you come away with a different view of communism. It should be required reading on college campuses. Now, let's go this way for a second, Stephen Mosher. In China currently, you documented that churches. This makes me sick to even say. Churches are being turned into civilization practice stations for the new era, which it just makes me thank God that I'm an American and I'm not living in a place like China. So Bibles are confiscated. Pictures of Jesus are being taken down to replace with obviously pictures of Chairman Mao and Secretary Xi. So talk to that a little bit about how just they don't hide their hatred of religion. It's right in your face, and your book documents that.
Well, no, they hate God, and of course they hate any expressions of devotion or love or worship of God. And they do it in part because of something that came up earlier in our conversation. The communism is not a religion, but it is a political cult. And like all cults, it has its own doctrine, it has its own particular rights, and it has a leadership hierarchy. And so the Chinese Communist Party would like people to be members in China of what I call the Church of China. In other words, they would like people to worship their country, worship the Chinese Communist Party. In the Church of China, the people of China will be sitting quietly in the pews like sheep. The acolytes in the Church of China would be the 94 million members of the Chinese Communist Party. And the head of the Church of China would be Xi Jinping, the head of the Chinese Communist Party himself. That's the notion, I think, if you put it down on paper, of how the country should be organized on a sort of a quasi-religious basis. Now, they've gone through and destroyed churches. They've gone through, and the churches they haven't destroyed, they've taken down crosses in. They've put up pictures of their new saints. These are Mao Zedong and Xi Jinping. I had to laugh. They're not saints, of course. They're among the most evil men who've ever existed. But those are the icons that are put up in the so-called state-run churches of China. The other thing they've done that people need to know, and this is in the book too, is they have rewritten the Bible. We, for many, many years, we in the West have taken smuggled Bibles into China and made sure that people in China, the tens of millions of Christians in China, have access to the Holy Scriptures. But the Chinese Communist Party has decided to rewrite the Bible. They've done away with the book of Revelation because all they want to focus on is the here and now. They don't believe in the hereafter, so that part's out. But they've also rewritten a lot of the stories in the Gospels, and I'll just tell you one. You remember the story of the woman caught in adultery when our Lord challenges those who are about to stone her to death to reflect on their own sins, and one by one they all put down their stones and go away. And he says to the woman, "Does anyone condemn you?" And "No, my Lord," she says. And he says, "Neither do I. Go and sin no more." In the Communist Party's version of that story, the beginning is the same, but in the end, when everyone else leaves, Jesus stones her to death himself. That's what the communists would like you to believe about our Lord and Savior. So it's a complete a parody doesn't begin to describe the desecration that they've done to Holy Scriptures. It's a complete blasphemy. But that's what the Chinese Communist Party would like Christians to read and think about the Savior of the world. There is in China an effort to destroy all religions, starting with Catholicism, because Catholicism has international connections, right? The head of the church is in Rome. It's outside of China. And so every Catholic in China is almost by definition, in the eyes of the Chinese Communist Party, disloyal, because its loyalties are with the head of the church, which is outside of China itself. So Catholics have been a particular target from the beginning, but it's Christians as well. It's Buddhists, Tibetan Buddhists, classical Buddhists, Taoists. You go to a Buddhist temple now, you don't hear the Buddhist sutras being recited on the loudspeakers. You hear the speech of Xi Jinping, the new Red Emperor, on religion being played over and over and over again all day long on the loudspeakers. It must drive the monks mad. Anyway, that's they intend to replace all religious sentiment, or they would like to replace all religious sentiment with belief in the Chinese Communist Party and belief in the fantasy that one day heaven on earth is going to materialize. And in the meantime, you'd better obey the new Red Emperor Xi Jinping, or we'll kill you.
And some people might hear what you just said and say, "Oh, that's just such an you right wing Catholics or something like that." No, it's just kind of like that's right. That's exactly the way it is in China. Okay, it's never been a matter of, see, this is what I mean, and just to get political for a second, the Democrat Party used to be anti-communist back before I was born, but at some point they were anti-communist. Aggressively so, okay, and rightfully so. John Kennedy was an anti-communist. So many Democrats were anti-communist, and I don't understand. It's like if you talk the way you just did, Stephen Mosher joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe. Somehow there's something wrong with me. There's like I'm missing something. I don't know how to read a history book. Is that a joke? And these little radicals that are walking around on these college campuses, somehow they have insight into human history that I don't, or insight into, let's say, communist ideology that I don't, or you don't, or Joe doesn't. It's thoroughly annoying. And that's the Italian, North Jersey Italian coming out in me, Stephen Mosher, because sometimes you want to just tell people, listen, you don't know what you're talking about. You might as well just go into the corner and shut up until you do know what you're talking about. That's my rant. Joe Resinello.
Stephen, there's an old saying, it's good for thee, but not for me. And that is the saying of the leadership in communist countries. The rules don't apply to them. I'm interested in the double standard that Xi lives and the leaders of China versus the people. We could also look to Cuba. Same thing. I had a friend that recently went to Cuba. He said there's a special part of the island where the leadership of Cuba live, and the rest of the people not only can't go there, they can't see it. Let's talk about even some of the leadership in soft socialist countries. We'll use the United States, for example. During the heart of COVID, Barack Obama has a 60th birthday party. Meanwhile, people can't work and can't eat. Gavin Newsom is caught in restaurants eating without a mask. Meanwhile, people can't work and can't eat. The governor of Michigan, same deal. It's good for thee. It's not. But at the end of the day, it doesn't apply to me. People have to see that, but they just choose not to talk about it.
Stephen, just to give you a heads up, we're going to probably come up on the break during your answer. If we do, I'll give you a little signal and then we'll pick it up on the other side.
All right. Well, look, in China, the uh, the Communist Party leaders live like kings. In fact, saying that, it doesn't give the full measure of the kinds of things they enjoy. Chairman Mao, whom I write about a lot in The Devil and Communist China, who's one of the most evil men who ever existed. The natural law, which is written in the human heart, is basically, you can sum it up by saying, do good, avoid evil. Everyone knows that instinctively. It doesn't matter whether you were born into a Christian society, born Catholic or whatever. Even a pagan in a distant land knows that you're supposed to be kind to your fellow human beings and not do evil, not deliberately hurt people. Mao chose to do evil and avoid doing good consciously. And among the things he enjoyed was an effort to achieve immortality. This is a violation, of course, of the sixth commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. He was married 4 times, abandoned one wife after another. But he decided in his 60s that he was going to achieve immortality by sleeping with 1,000 virgins. He had read an ancient Chinese history book which said that the mythical Yellow Emperor had achieved immortality that way, and so he was going to live forever. And so he had little village girls brought in, 12, 13, and 14, every night for years. Despicable human being. He avoided the good and chose evil at every turn. He also lived like a king of old would have admired his lifestyle. For goodness sake, he had resorts in every province. He had his own trains, his own planes. He brought his own bed with him wherever he went on his own custom-made bed with him on the train or to his resorts. He had to sleep in his own bed. And he enjoyed the best of what China had to offer. The Chinese Communist Party consumes about a third of everything produced in China. So the hard work of the 1.4 billion Chinese, 1/3 of everything they produce is consumed by the Chinese Communist Party. About half of that is used for their salaries and their resorts and their foreign junkets and their banquets and so forth, their staff, their chauffeured limousine. Another half is just corruption, because the Communist Party leaders at all levels are engaged in theft, stealing from the people. They all have overseas bank accounts in the Caymans or the Bahamas. And I'm talking about the new Red Emperor, Xi Jinping himself. His family has bank accounts in the Bahamas. We know that. They all have investments and homes and other things here in the United States or in Canada or Australia, New Zealand, countries with the rule of law. So they know that if they're ever thrown out of power by the next Red Emperor, they can always flee to the United States and enjoy the benefits of democracy and the rule of law here. So it's a totally corrupt system from top to bottom. And why would some young 18-year-old student at Harvard University think otherwise? Well, because they were told by some 35-year-old professor at Harvard University that communism is an idealistic drive towards a perfect society where everybody is equal. And that 35-year-old has never actually started a business, has never actually traveled overseas, has no real world experience, and is just regurgitating what he or she has heard from his own professor, who was equally deluded about the nature of communism. It just goes on, passed like a virus from one generation of academics to another.
Oh, that's and we'll pick that up on the other side of the break, because I'd love to know what you think about maybe some ways we could combat that here in America. If you're just joining us at the front line with Joe and Joe, Stephen Mosher's with us. This is a fantastic and important conversation. The Devil and Communist China. The book is available at TANBooks. Please support the publishers as well as our authors. And yeah, stick around. We have another great segment with Stephen Mosher. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone, to the front line with Joe and Joe Pasillo and Joe Rossinello. We are weighing the breach on the Veritas Catholic Radio Network with Stephen Mosher. We're discussing his new book, The Devil and Communist China. That's available at TANBooks. Stephen, where else did you say folks can buy the book?
They can get it from our website at Population Research Institute. That's pop.org, POP.org. And if they get it from us, I'll be able to sign the book before I send it out.
All right. And appreciate that, Stephen. Joe, if I may, I want to start this segment off real quick. Here's my thought. Tell me if you agree, disagree, or talk about it a little bit. The communist impulse, let's say this is the same basically as the population control nuts out there. And what I mean by that is this: their beef with the world is that there's too many people, and they try to convince people through fear that the world is going to come to a crashing end. I didn't know if anybody told you that, Stephen Mosher. It's like everything's just going to start burning down, right? If we don't start listening to John Kerry, everything we spoke about in the first segment, the elitism, the way Xi and the rest of them live their lives as opposed to the people of China. You can apply all that to American elites like John Kerry and people like that. He has to fly around the world. Stephen, didn't anybody tell you, on his private jet because he's important. He's trying to save the planet. I think you know where I'm going. The parallels are striking, and I'll be honest with you. I think the population control nuts. I think they're just as evil as the communists. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. And, we've always, as Catholics, as Christians, have always tried to create, following our Lord's instructions, a civilization of life and love, right? Love of God and love of neighbor. The two are intricately related. If you love God, you love your neighbor, and vice versa. Communism is the evil opposite of that. It is based on hatred of God, which naturally is reflected in hatred of one's fellow human beings. And even Chairman Mao said that. The first Red Emperor back in the 1950s. He understood that communism was based on hate. In fact, in one point in time, he said he really exulted in the power, the destructive power that this hate unleashed. He said, communism is not love, quote unquote. Communism is not love. He said, communism is a hammer that we use to crush the enemy. Now, of course, he was someone who wielded the hammer of communism so effectively that he became the greatest mass murderer in human history. So we should take what he said seriously. Communism is hate weaponized. And Archbishop Fulton Sheen, the great evangelist of the mid-20th century, was at pains to say the same thing. In contrast to the Christian philosophy of forgiveness, he said, there exists in the first time in the history of the world a philosophy and a political and social system based not on love but on hate, and that is communism. Hatred of God and hatred of neighbor. How is that hate expressed? It's expressed by killing. It's expressed by disdain for your fellow human beings. And that disdain is expressed in different ways, but it's certainly expressed by the population control movement, Joe, because they hate the rest of humanity. They want to reduce the population of the planet from 8 billion down to 1 billion. What are they going to do with the other 7 billion of us? I hesitate to think. The same idea, the same philosophy was exported to China. You see, China's one-child policy didn't originate in China. No, it originated in the 1970s with the Club of Rome reporting that we were going to be running out of petroleum and chrome and iron and zinc and everything else by the 1990s. There was going to be total civilizational collapse. We were all going to starve to death. And that idea, that pernicious idea, that anti-human idea, found its way to China. And guess what? Deng Xiaoping, then the leader of China, decided that the only thing that he could do was follow the best in Western science, the science, right? The science. We all know about the science now. But he thought he was following the best of Western science in declaring that China was going to embark on a one-child policy. Now, the way they carried out the policy was following standard communist practice, right? I mean, they took this idea and ran with it. They put the entire Communist Party to work in controlling and throttling the reproductive impulses of the Chinese people. They sent cadres door to door. I saw them when I was in China in 1980, going door to door, identifying all the women who were pregnant with a second or third or fourth child, and ordering that woman to attend what were called study sessions. They weren't study sessions, they were brainwashing sessions, where the Communist Party leaders said to these pregnant women, young women in their early 20s, mid-20s, late 20s, that for the good of the country, for the good of the commune, for the good of the Chinese Communist Party, they had to abort their children. Now, communism, let me say, always targets a specific group. It has to, because it feeds on hate. That's the fuel that you have to put into the furnace of hate of communism. You have to continue feeding it victims, right? As the ancient Canaanites threw their children into the flaming furnace in the idol of Baal. They have to keep feeding victims into the furnace to fuel this hate, because it's a system based on hate. And so you go through the capitalists, you throw them in the furnace, you fuel the furnace, you throw in the landlords, you throw in the writers. And in 1980, they started throwing in the babies, and they threw in 400 million of them into this fiery furnace from 1980 to 2016. 400 million unborn and newborn children were killed as part of the one-child policy. The biggest killing machine in human history had found its biggest class of victims. I mentioned earlier 100 million Chinese were killed by Mao and the Communist Party. That doesn't include the 400 million little victims of the one-child policy. Add those two numbers together, it's 500 million. That's a 500 million people. That's a truly insane level of killing. But the killing was necessary because the system feeds on hate. So you have to constantly feed the furnace.
Stephen Mosher, I don't know who disgusts me more, those who commit the murders or those who either don't care or just turn a blind eye to it and don't want to listen to things like what you're saying, pointing out what you document, what you're talking about here, and what you wrote in your book. The book is The Devil in Communist China. The publisher is Tan Books. And please, please, please go out and buy the book. One thing Joe and I say on the show all the time, and then I'm going to send it over to Joe Rossinello, is that we learn as well as our audience. We have on guests that are going to educate Joe and I on these things as well as our audience. And I think one of the more powerful things we could do, and we'll talk about solutions in a little bit, or maybe some solutions, is educate ourselves. Know what you're talking about when you're arguing with people who would actually support this evil. All right, know what you're talking about, and you do that by reading books like Stephen Mosher's and others. Joe Rossinello.
Stephen, let's talk about how the CCP spread its lies across Asia. I have never been to mainland China. I have been to the state of West Bengal in India. For many, many years, they elected a communist government. Recently, that has been elected out as India has become a little bit more prosperous. I have backpacked through Vietnam. I've seen communism in Vietnam firsthand. Talk about how the lies have been spread, how they are actively fermenting and, frankly, hurting people to this very day.
Well, Our Lady Fatima said that Russia would spread its errors throughout the world, and the biggest victory, I think, in that proliferation of communism was the communist takeover of China, which would not have happened without support of the Soviet Union. Stalin was sending agents, he was sending arms, he was sending money every single month for years and years to Chairman Mao during the revolution. He armed the Red Army and enabled them to defeat the nationalists and take over China. And it didn't stop there because it then spread to North Korea. People don't know that during the Chinese Civil War, there were 200,000 armed North Korean communists fighting on behalf of the Red Army against the nationalists and Chiang Kai-shek. And once the communism took over China, Mao returned the favor by fighting on behalf of the North Korean communists against the United States in the Korean War. We fought them to a draw, but it was a bitter, bitter contest. In Vietnam, we were also fighting against China. China spread its ideas to Vietnam early. Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the North Vietnamese communists, lived in China for many years, received support from the Chinese Communist Party. During the Vietnam War, there were 300,000 Chinese troops in North Korea. They wore Vietnamese army uniforms. They tried to keep a low profile, but they were there supporting the cause. North Vietnam would not have conquered the South without support from China. Pol Pot, who has one outstanding feature, he killed a greater percentage of the Cambodian population than any communist in history. He killed between a quarter and a third of the 8 million people during his brief tenure in power in the country of Cambodia. He was a great admirer, too, of Chairman Mao and the Red Guards. And boy, did he engage in a bloody killing spree in Cambodia. China continues to spread its errors around the world. It wants to set up a competing world order. You know, we have in the United States at the end of World War II put in place the current world order and tried in fits and starts, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, to promote free speech and democracy and human rights in different parts of the world. We're not doing that very well right now. That's a subject for another day. But we did do it for decades. We did it under Reagan, for example. But China does the opposite. China is spreading its evil ideology everywhere it can in Latin America, in other Asian countries, and in Africa. And if you point to a dictator, and I don't care whether it's an African dictator or a Latin American dictator like Maduro in Venezuela, you will find that their best friend is always the Chinese Communist Party and its leaders. And you will find that there are money and arms flowing into those countries in order to support those dictatorships. So China, at the end of the day, wants a completely different world order. It wants to be the dominant power on the planet. It realizes that the United States and China cannot coexist. It believes that at the end of the day, and I have read the Chinese documents to say this, at the end of the day, only one system will dominate, and it wants the Chinese Communist Party to be the dominant political power in the world, and the U.S. to be reduced to a kind of semi-colonial status. That's their goal. We need to understand that. They're at war with us. And if your enemy is at war with you, then you're probably at war whether you want to be or not.
Well, I think I'm gonna see if I could play a little devil's advocate here. Okay, I think a lot of people don't know what's going on in China. Or Stephen Mosher, you tell me what you think. They see that we do business with China. LeBron James does business with China. If you speak out against the Chinese Communist Party, okay, American corporations think you're the bad guy because they want to do business with China. And the average American might be saying, well, if we do business with them, how bad could they be? Because we do, whether it's basketball teams, whether it's, shoe manufacturers, whoever it might be. Why is it that we're so, I don't even know the word to use, Stephen Mosher. Maybe you can help me out. We don't speak out enough and tell American corporations, just as people, just as regular people say, I'm not doing business with you. If you're doing business with communist China, or if you're profiting off their slave labor or any such thing, I'm not doing business with you at all until you stop doing business with them. So maybe internationally, we could put some kind of pressure on China, unless you think, Stephen, what I'm saying is just me being a little wild-eyed pie in the sky. But is there something we could do to shame people who are doing business and making money off communist China?
Well, I mean, we can boycott Chinese goods. I've been doing that for 3 decades now, and I think post-COVID, and we know that the coronavirus was released from a Chinese lab in the city of Wuhan. I was the first person, one of the first people to say that in early February of 2020, and boy, did I get banned on Facebook and Twitter and every place you can imagine for saying the obvious truth that it came from the Wuhan lab, which it did. Post-COVID, I think sentiment in the United States has dramatically shifted from 20 or 30% realizing that China was the threat 10 years ago to now we're up to about 80% of Americans realize that the Chinese Communist Party, and we always have to distinguish between the party and the people, the Chinese Communist Party does not wish us well. In fact, it carried out biological warfare against us. Right now, it is carrying out chemical warfare against us. It's sending fentanyl to this country that kills over 100,000 Americans every year and leaves millions of others addicted. It is engaged in cyber warfare against us, has from the beginning of the internet, and is constantly engaging in espionage and stealing our intellectual property. So China's really, the Chinese Communist Party has been at war with us across all domains except the kinetic. We're not firing bullets at each other for a long, long time. I think people are beginning to understand that. As far as the Fortune 500 companies, who all went into China when I did in the 1980s and 90s, thinking that they were going to have a market of 1 billion people and they were going to make bank from selling goods, making goods in China and selling them to the Chinese people. Their technology has been stolen. They are trapped capitalists. They cannot get their capital out of China. They're being squeezed out of the Chinese market. Yeah, you can make goods cheaply with slave labor, but at the end of the day, you're beholden. You're in business with the biggest criminal conspiracy in world history, the Chinese Communist Party, the biggest organized terrorist group in history, the Chinese Communist Party. Do you really want to be in business with those kinds of people? And we're seeing, I think, decoupling now. I think we're seeing factories moving to places like India, Philippines, Canada, even back to the United States where they should be, as people realize that at the end of the day, our two systems are totally incompatible. And even people like, Apple is gradually being squeezed out of the China market. So is Tesla. Elon Musk just went to China and signed a new agreement, but he's being squeezed out of China. His vehicles are being gradually squeezed out of China as well. They will squeeze him dry and then at the end of the day, send him packing as well. So if you really want to do business with an organized criminal conspiracy, they will let you make money for a time, but at the end of the day, you will regret having gone in.
I'm going to hand it over to Joe Resinello, Stephen Mosher. Back in the day in North New Jersey, there was a lot of bookmakers around, all right? And most of them were organized crime, okay? And then if you ask the average person, he would say, I'm not involved with those guys. They're thugs and gangsters and this and that. But you put in a $500 bet every Sunday, don't you? You support their business, don't you? Okay? And it's the same type of thing. If you're contributing to it, okay, then, you need to stop contributing to it. Like you used the word, decouple, get away, start pulling back and be more aware where we're spending our money. And Joe and I talk on the show all the time, Stephen Mosher, about, boycotts work. I don't care what American knee-jerk conservatives bow at the altar of the free market say. We should boycott corporations that do business with communist China. That's another conversation. Joe Resinello.
Let's talk social credit score. Why is it dangerous? What is it? And can it spread to the United States?
Well, yeah, I think it's already here, at least in its early iterations. The Chinese Communist Party has what's called a social credit score for everybody in the country. And we should really call it not a social credit score, but a political credit score, because it's a gauge of how well people talk about and think about and write about and speak about the Chinese Communist Party. And if you say nice things on social media about the Chinese Communist Party, if you say nice things on your cell phone, if you associate with people who are also party members or who speak well of the party, your social credit score goes up. And guess what? You can get a passport from the Chinese Communist Party, and maybe even an exit visa to travel out of the country. You can fly from one city to another. You can take the high-speed rail. You can get a low-interest rate loan to buy a home or a car. Everything is easy. The Communist Party likes you, and so it wants you to prosper. On the other hand, if your social credit score goes down, guess what? You can't fly inside of China. You can't get a passport. Certainly can't leave the country. You can't take the high-speed rail. You have to go on the slow train that takes you 2 days to get from Beijing to Shanghai, because it stops at every little podunk station on the way. You can't buy a home or a car because no one is willing to loan you money because your social credit score is too low. So all doors are closed to you. And if it drops too low, if you're too critical of the party, guess what? At the end of the day, there's a midnight knock on the door and you're taken away for political re-education for a couple of years. So it's a way of keeping track of everybody all the time in real time by monitoring where they go, where they spend their money, who they associate with, what they say, what they read, and so forth. It's the dream, the ancient totalitarian dream come alive. The left used to say, well, you people on the right are just exaggerating when you talk about totalitarianism, because it's impossible to ever conceive of a truly totalitarian regime. How could you watch all the people all the time? Well, you can now with modern technology, with artificial intelligence, with surveillance cameras. China has more surveillance cameras than any other country in the world by far. You can, in real time, using artificial intelligence, watch all the people all the time. And it is a truly totalitarian nightmare. China is a high-tech digital dictatorship. And I tell you, there are people here, especially in one side of the political spectrum, who admire China's ability to control its people, where they go, what they think, where they spend their money, and they would like to bring it here.
Well, aren't we seeing that in the West? You have, I believe it was Nigel Farage. He wasn't able to do business with the bank he was doing business with because they don't like what you're saying, Stephen Mosher.
Right.
See, again, this is where the vein pops out of my head when it comes to talking to some of these people. Stop talking to me about freedom, because most of the time when people in the West who are on the political left talk about freedom, it all has to do with sexual freedom, contraception, abortion, gay marriage, and all that bunk. Okay, all that nonsense. That's their definition of freedom. But when you want to say my First Amendment, I have a First Amendment right to speak out against all that nonsense. Oh, no, you don't. And they continually try to get around it. I wish people would understand this. Isn't it? When people talk about hate speech was developed over time at Ivy League universities and law schools to get around the First Amendment, not just the right to speak freely, all right, but the right to free association. And this is where I'm going, Stephen Mosher, the right to the free expression of my religion. That means in the public square. That doesn't mean behind the four walls of my house. Okay, I have the right to go into the public square with my Catholic faith, and the First Amendment protects me. Let's spend the last couple of minutes talking about the state, excuse me, of the Catholic Church in China. From Joe and my perspective, it doesn't look that great. Now, we know God's in charge. We don't lose hope. We're not the despairing kind, okay? But it's not a really good situation. How about, I'm going to just throw the floor over to you, Stephen, to let us know and our audience here at the Veritas Catholic Radio Network what is going on with the state of the Catholic Church in China.
Well, I think the demonic nature of communist China ought to be evident to everyone. It certainly is evident to Catholics and Christians in China, because they've had targets on their backs for decades. In the 1950s, the Chinese Communist Party tried to crush the church in China. It failed. By 1958, it had set up a false church, a schismatic organization called the Catholic Patriotic Association. But in the Cultural Revolution, many Catholics were still sent to jail, sent to prison for long prison terms. The period of the 80s and 90s was a little more open. I was able, through the Population Research Institute, actually, Joe, to build a couple of churches in China and open orphanages in China in the 1990s. It became possible for the first time because the Communist Party was interested in economic development, and there was a period of relative openness. That is no longer possible. The churches we've talked about are being closed down and replaced by what I call the Church of China. Will the church continue to survive? Absolutely. The church has always survived under persecution. The great Cardinal Zen has said that to priests and bishops in China, don't join the Catholic Patriotic Association. If you need to, just go back to your village and work in the fields until better times come. But do not acknowledge the Chinese Communist Party as your God. That's what the Chinese Communist Party would like. They would like to turn the ancient statement, the statement of St. Thomas More, on its head. You remember St. Thomas More said, when the king said, you have to recognize me as the head of the church, he said, I am the king's good servant, but I am God's first. Well, in China, the Chinese Communist Party wants you to say, I am the Chinese Communist Party's I worship God, but I worship the Chinese Communist Party first. And a lot of Catholics in China are not willing to say that, and never will be, even at risk of martyrdom.
Stephen Mosher joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe. Please go out and buy his new book, The Devil and Communist China, that's available at TANBooks. Joe, we got about 3 minutes left for Stephen Mosher. What do you want to leave off with?
Well, we're talking about the church. Let's talk about Jimmy Lai. I recently saw the documentary, The Hong Konger. I was very impressed by it. Jimmy Lai, if you ask me, is a modern day saint. He is a modern day Thomas More. He was a billionaire. He's in prison. Convert to the church. Talk about him, because honestly, he's a hero. A lot of people don't know who he is.
Jimmy Lai was the last voice of press freedom in Hong Kong for many years. Hong Kong was handed back over by the British to the Chinese Communist Party in 1997. Now, I have to tell people, I lived in Hong Kong. I went to the Chinese University of Hong Kong to learn Chinese. I have lots of friends in Hong Kong. So I know the city like the back of my hand. 7.5 million free people, free under British rule, to live where they want and to choose their own local legislature. The Chinese Communist Party promised that it would keep that system in place for 50 years. The party always lies, and it lied in this case. It tore up the agreement almost as soon as the British left, and it has now taken over absolute control of the colony, and the 7.5 million people in Hong Kong no longer have anything resembling the rule of law. The judicial system has been corrupted. And Jimmy Lai, who ran the Apple Daily in Hong Kong, was the lone voice criticizing the misdeeds, the excesses of the Chinese Communist Party, has been arrested for that and charged with violating the new national security law. You know, all of these things we're talking about in China now resonate to me as an American, because we're seeing the same things creep into our society, aren't we? But Jimmy Lai is in prison, and he fully expects to be in prison for the rest of his life and die in prison. He has never lost sight of the fact that fundamentally his battle against communism is a spiritual battle. And he always, Jimmy Lai, always in his writings and in his speeches, reminds us of the power to combat evil that we've received in Jesus Christ. He's spending his days in his cell praying and painting icons. And again, he's a martyr for the Catholic faith.
Well, let's keep Jimmy Lai in our prayers, everyone out there listening to us at the Veritas Catholic Radio Network. So, Stephen Mosher, real quick, the book one more time, where our folks can buy it, and what else you have going on with the work with the Population Research Institute and all that. Let our folks know where they can learn more about you and your work.
Well, the organization is the Population Research Institute. We have in years past cut over $1 billion from the population controllers. The idea that we should, the United States should be going into relative innocent, untouched corners of the world and telling people there that they have to legalize gay marriage and legalize abortion. And by the way, they should sterilize, abort, and contracept their women so that they lower their birth rate to below replacement. All of that stuff is not something I'm proud of that our country is doing. And so we fight against it. We make the case that babies are blessings and not burdens. We encourage people to have large families. And that's what we do at the Population Research Institute. Of course, I'm a China hand. So whenever I speak, the topic of China comes up. I wrote The Devil in Communist China to make people aware of not only what's going on in China, but how a lot of what's happening in China is beginning to creep into our own country. And so China, looking at China's cautionary tale of one possible future for the United States that we must, through prayer and hard work, avoid at all costs. The website.
Absolutely. I'm sorry, Stephen, we're coming up on the end, so let's just leave it there. Thank you so much, Stephen Mosher. Needless to say, this was a great conversation. You're welcome back at the front line with Joe and Joe anytime, our brother.
Look forward to it.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you all out there for joining us at the Veritas Catholic Radio Network, 1350 on your AM dial, 103.9 on your FM dial, spreading the truth of the Catholic faith to the New York City metropolitan area. Download the app, share it with your friends, share this conversation, please, more importantly, with your friends and whoever you can. And if you're watching this on social media, whether it's Rumble, X, Facebook, YouTube, share it. The more we know, the more we can engage in this battle. So this was a conversation where you're going to come away with a lot of information. So please, we encourage you to do so. Thank you once again. And remember, until the next time, that our conversation is your conversation, and that conversation is going on everywhere. We'll talk to you soon.